So, picture this. We're at the 2026 FIFA World Cup, and the Spanish national team is just absolutely dominating the pitch. Now, if you've been following the international coverage, especially in Japanese media, you've probably heard them called this incredibly dramatic nickname, the Invincible Armada, or Muteki Kantai. I mean, it sounds powerful, right? It totally conjures up this image of an unstoppable, terrifying force just sweeping across the globe. But here's the thing. There's a massive, glaring historical contradiction here. Why on earth would you name a winning team after a losing fleet? Because, yeah, the original 16th century Spanish Armada actually suffered one of the most crushing, devastating defeats in naval history. It was such an immense tragedy that over in Spain, calling someone the Invincible Armada isn't a compliment at all. Actually, it's pretty much considered a symbol of terrible luck. So you're probably wondering, what do the Spanish fans actually call their team? Well, their official and definitely preferred nickname is La Roja, which just translates to the red, named directly after the color of their iconic kits. The whole Muteki Kantai thing was actually dreamt up by Japanese football magazines back in the 1990s, when Spain was on a really long unbeaten run. It sounded cool, so it stuck abroad, but domestically, yeah, Spanish fans are strictly cheering for La Roja. Okay, to really grasp why this nickname carries so much heavy historical baggage, we've got to jump all the way back to 1588. Spain's Catholic King Philip II decides he's going to launch this colossal naval fleet across the English Channel to invade Protestant England. He pulls together roughly 130 ships. At the time, this was just an unimaginable display of wealth and military muscle. Everyone, and I mean everyone, expected this to be an unstoppable force that would just steamroll Queen Elizabeth I's realm. But the moment they hit the English Channel, this massive tactical mismatch became painfully obvious. See, the Spanish Armada relied on these huge, towering galleons. They were packed to the brim with soldiers and short-range cannons, because their whole game plan was close-quarters combat, literally grappling the enemy ships and fighting hand-to-hand. The English fleet, though, completely different approach. They were in these nimble, lower-built warships with long-range cannons. They just focused on evasive maneuvers, striking from a distance where the heavy Spanish ships literally couldn't even touch them. So how exactly did this quote-unquote invincible fleet fall apart? Well, while the Spanish were anchored off the coast of Calais, the English pulled off this devastating tactical surprise: fire ships. In the dead of night, they took these old boats, loaded them up with gunpowder and pitch, set them completely on fire, and just let them drift directly into the densely packed Spanish fleet. It was absolute panic. The tightly organized Spanish crescent formation completely shattered. Captains were desperately cutting their own anchors just to get away, and the entire armada was forced into a chaotic, blind retreat into the North Sea. Now, while all this chaos is raging out at sea, there's this incredibly powerful moment happening back on land. The threat of a Spanish invasion was still very, very real to the people of England. So Queen Elizabeth I rides directly out to the front lines at Tilbury to address her terrified troops, and she delivers what is now known as one of the most legendary speeches in history. She tells them, "I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." And what makes this speech so absolutely brilliant, like why historians still obsess over it today, is her masterful rhetoric. She totally flipped 16th century gender expectations on their head. By openly admitting her physical vulnerability as a woman in that era, she connected with her soldiers on this really grounded human level. But then, right in the next breath, she claims the inner courage and total authority of an English king. That shift from humility to just fierce self-affirmation, it completely electrified her troops. They were ready to fight to the death for her. But out in the North Sea, the Spanish fleet was meeting a horrific end. Out of the roughly 130 ships that proudly left Lisbon, only 67 limped their way back to Spain. And here's the really tragic twist: it wasn't even the English cannons that did most of the damage. Forced into this brutal retreat route up past Scotland and around the Irish coast, the fleet was absolutely hammered by violent Atlantic storms. The rough weather and the jagged coastlines ended up claiming far more Spanish lives and ships than the actual combat ever did. All right, let's pivot back to sports and look at how this history ties into our modern story. It's honestly fascinating because for decades, the Spanish national football team almost perfectly and kind of darkly mirrored their doomed historical namesake. On one hand, you had the 1588 Armada. Grand expectations, this massive assembly of talent, but ultimately doomed by poor execution and horrible luck. On the other hand, you had 20th century Spanish football, blessed with some of the best domestic talent on the planet, yet globally known as perennial losers. It's a pretty striking parallel, right? let's talk about that perennial losers era for a second. Spain constantly had these world-class players starring in La Liga week in and week out. Because of that, every single major tournament, they showed up with these massive sky-high expectations. And yet, they just couldn't win when it actually mattered. They were notoriously haunted by this quarterfinal curse, constantly crashing out early in the knockout stages. Whether it was missing easy shots or just a streak of mind-bogglingly bad luck, the heartbreak was, well, it was basically routine. But then, everything changed. We get to the ultimate turning point that broke this curse for good, the invention and total mastery of the tiki-taka style. And listen, this wasn't just some minor tactical tweak, it was a total revolution in how football was played. Tiki-taka was all about these mesmerizing, rapid-fire short passes and just absolute total ball possession. By constantly moving the ball around between their players, they literally starved the opposing team. I mean, you can't attack if you never touch the ball, right? The result of that tactical revolution was just staggering. Spain entered this unprecedented golden era and finally evolved into true world champions. First, they grabbed the Euro 2008 title, breaking a 44-year trophy drought, which is huge. Then, at the 2010 World Cup in South Africa, they won their first ever world title. And they didn't stop there. They followed it up by dominating Euro 2012, winning 3 consecutive major international titles. That completely erased the old stigma. The perennial losers had officially become an undisputed historical dynasty. Fast forward to today, and we're looking at a team that has clearly reawakened that winning DNA. Heading into the 2026 World Cup, they aren't just coasting on the ghosts of 2010. They're arriving as the reigning 2024 European champions. They're riding this massive wave of recent momentum, proving to everyone that they are absolutely a dominant, highly dangerous force on the global stage right now. The 2026 squad we're seeing, managed by Luis de la Fuente, is just beautifully organized. They've found this incredible balance, mixing young, explosive prodigies like Lamine Yamal with seasoned, rock-solid veterans like Mikel Oyarzabal. It's a fluid, really smart system that still honors those tiki-taka roots, but brings in a lot of modern speed, directness, and physical toughness. So, the ultimate question is this: will this modern armada forge a new golden era and finally live up to that incredibly heavy historical nickname? Can this current generation achieve the kind of absolute, undisputed dominance that so tragically slipped through the fingers of the original 1588 fleet? As you watch the rest of this 2026 World Cup play out, keep an ear open for those echoes of the past out there on the pitch. It's going to be a thrilling ride. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and enjoy the rest of the tournament.